I want to cite. Yes, but no, not erase.
Okay, so incorrect. Which means you don't use a page number.
Yes, that's right. Only the date.
Only the date, exactly.
What does paraphrase mean? I forget.
Say the same thing in another words.
Come on. Say it again.
Like try to say the same idea but with other words.
With fewer words, too.
Yes.
Less words.
Yeah, okay. Just checking.
So yeah, I've never used NPA. I use either Chicago style or LA. They're both slightly different. Chicago uses footnotes.
Okay.
Let's look at the.
I'll open up both of them and then just so we have them open. And then, whoops. I don't know why it does this. Sometimes it opens it up. Oh, it's a document. Okay.
We download it?
I guess, yeah. Let's open up the other one. The other one's mathematics, right? Mathematics. Okay, which one did you want to look at first?
The shorter one first.
Which one?
Just the other one.
Okay.
It was written in 2010.
Okay. All right, let me just get this going. Is that the right one?
That's the right one.
Okay.
Thanks. So, I'm actually going to double space this really quick. Formatting, Spanish Microsoft Word. Inicio.
Yes.
I read there. Yeah.
Yes.
Right there.
Yes.
I'll do two. So this, I had some difficulty finding an argumentative essay to show you guys, probably because I have a new computer. Like right after I finished my thesis and graduated from college, my computer just died. So when I had all through college and I had everything, I managed to save most of it in an external hard drive, but the stuff that I have now in Mexico is just stuff that randomly got put up in my Dropbox. So there's like a few things from 2008 to 2013. This is one that I found that really has kind of a pretty formal argumentative style and structure. A lot of the papers I wrote in college kind of departed from just a regular like structure, as in like supporting claim, competing claim, response to competing claim, conclusion, right? But this one, the teacher was a real stickler, and we had to write these things called shorts, short historical response paper. I don't know if that's what the acronym stood for or what, but we had to do these we had to do like 3 of these a week. And we were given these questions that went along with the readings that we had, and had to answer them in about 250 words or less. So the question here is, on what grounds does Philip Caputo argue that Mexico is a nation state on the brink of failure? On what grounds does Enrique Krauss reject arguments like that of Caputo? Does anybody know who Krauss is? Enrique Krauss? He's the guy who wrote a really famous book about the PRI, called what's it called? Biography of Power. I think it's called Biography of Power. Yeah, it's a whole history of the PRI that's really famous. And he worked for a long time for Octavio Paz's magazine. Anyway, so we read an article by this guy, Philip Caputo, about arguing that Mexico was on the brink of becoming a failed state. A failed state is a state that loses the functionality of its institutions, like the government ceases to have power, and there ceases to be kind of an effective or kind of a free connection between the people and the government, right? The government falls apart, the people aren't supported by the government, the people don't support the government, etc. Right? So famous examples, probably the most famous example is Somalia, where the people that are in charge are these different criminal organizations that control different cities or control different parts of the capital. So I thought we could maybe read this. Some of the language is kind of technical, but I think we can get through it. Maybe it's because it's about Mexico. It's kind of appropriate. Does someone want to read the first few sentences?
Load that up just.
Yeah, sure.
Bottom right hand corner, I think is probably the easiest.
Is that big enough?
Yes.
In the fall of Mexico, Philip Caputo addresses the increasing levels of drug-related violence in the northern states of Mexico, supporting the popular idea in the United States that Mexico is on the way towards collapsing into a failed state. The article is based on attempting to understand the complex system to drug trafficking, a tangled web of corruption, violence, and conflict between the Mexico's government, military, law enforcement agencies, and drug cartels. He argues that this is all compounded by the presence of the United States in Mexico, simultaneously actively involved in preventing drug trafficking and providing virtually all of demand for drugs exported from the South. Caputo argues that it is a fact dangerous to know the truth in Mexico, basing his observations on interviews with individuals both in and outside of the zones of conflict and violence, including personal testimony from Mexican reporters, activists, and ordinary civilians in and around northern cities where drug-related violence is most easily noticeable. Caputo bases in his arguments on the Mexico as a future failed state along the levels of corruption and conflict between different levels of administration in the Mexican state, namely between the state, the military, and the police. He addresses both underlying suspicions of Mexico as a failed state are based around supposition in the face of a dire problem, the extreme levels of violence in states like Chihuahua and Sinaloa.
Okay, so this is the first paragraph. This is kind of, how long are these papers that you guys are writing? How many pages are they? 3 pages?
How many paragraphs?
5 paragraphs. 5 paragraphs. So, if I wanted to give this more of a formal structure, I think I would probably include a paragraph before jumping into this talk of Caputo, right? Because here we have 2 guys, right? We have 2 writers, 2 scholars. One is an American who we just read about. We just read about this article that he wrote for the New York Times about Mexico as a, quote, failed state, right? The second one is a Mexican intellectual who's going to argue against that, right? So we have two viewpoints. Like with vegetarianism, there's a supporting claim that vegetarianism is good, and the dissenting claim that it's bad, right? So I guess your structure will be to introduce general context behind what you'll be discussing. Like maybe in the first paragraph, you could talk about how many Mexicans are vegetarians in the year 2014, how popular it is in this country, if more people are becoming vegetarians or less people, then maybe introduce the presence of a controversy or an argument between people saying, I know, for example, that some people say that vegetarians don't get enough nutrients because they don't eat meat, and it's natural for humans to eat meat, to get animal protein, that sort of thing. So these would be things that you discuss in the introduction, possibly, at least what I would do. And then you could go into talking about, for example, in your paper, the first claim, which is the one that you support. I don't really include myself in this, because this essay is more of a compare and contrast essay between two thinkers about one topic, right? So I'm not really including myself, and the goal is to summarize what they're saying. It's still argumentative because it's kind of elucidating, it's clarifying an argument, a specific argument, a specific instance of an argument, but it's not argumentative in the sense that I don't have a particular argument, right? And a lot of times, as you guys continue writing, you'll be asked to kind of find ways to express an argument without really expressing your opinion, right? So to be able to argue something by summarizing, combining, and comparing and contrasting what other people have said on a certain thing. Yes? Oftentimes, when you compare two people, you can express your support for one, or two different opinions. You can express your support for one just in the way that you write about them. Yes? So maybe if we read the second paragraph, we can see kind of who I agree with in this sense. Does someone want to read the second paragraph? Do you want to read it?
Yeah. Conversely, in the Mexican evolution, Enrique Krauss attacks the idea of Mexico as a failed state and define it as combined media creation of both Mexico and the United States, fueled by a rhetoric of fear. However, Krauss will disagree with Capullo's notion of Mexico as a failed state. In defending Mexico from this classification, Krauss notes a number of considerations that set Mexico apart from other failed states around the globe. Tolerant and secular state of Mexico. Its lack of religious tensions, it's inclusive and relatively egalitarian society. The lack of serious threats of regional secession, and the independence and democratic ideals of the Mexican political system, all of which offer direct contrast and establish failed nation states such as Afghanistan, Somalia, and Pakistan.
So what is he saying here in this paragraph?
It's kind of like it starts the contrast.
Yeah, so there's a contrast, but what is Krauss arguing? What's the evidence that he's presenting? Because remember, argumentation is not just a question of opinion, it's also a question of presenting evidence, presenting claims and then backing those claims up, which you guys do in your own papers. It's not just a question, it's like, I think vegetarianism is cool because I know I have some friends that are vegetarians and I really like them and they're really healthy, right? You have to do more than that, right? You have to provide facts and figures and dates and anecdotes and evidence, which is what Krauss does with a lot of different points to refute what this American guy is saying. So what does Krauss say? Mexico is not a failed state because
So it says like the media like control thing.
Yeah, he's saying that the media is responsible. So both the Mexican and the American media are responsible for creating this idea of Mexico as a failed state, right? The media, I know that in America, when I told people that I was coming to Mexico, a lot of people were like, "Oh my God, it's so dangerous." Right?
Yeah, I know.
But we all know that a place where I was coming to is very safe, right? We also all know that there are areas in Mexico which are dangerous. That doesn't mean the entirety of the country is dangerous, right? And so the American guy who wrote this essay is really probably responding in some way to the trends in the media representation of Mexico. And this, it came out he wrote it in like 2010, right? When the stuff with the Narcos was really bad.
Yes.
It was much worse, right? So Krauss wrote this response. And Krauss, if we wanted to make this a bit more complex, we could look into the authors themselves, right? If I wanted to put myself into it, I could critique who these guys are and what they're saying. Because Krauss has been known for a long time as kind of like a pre-puppet. He's like an intellectual that has enjoyed a lot of support from the government for a long time, right? So it's his role to offer defense of Mexico. What he says is that Mexico is not a failed state because we have Mexico's secular, tolerant, there's no religious tensions in the sense of example, like it's not like Israel and Palestine where there's tension between Jews and Muslims. You know, there's not much tension between evangelicals and Catholics, right? In Mexico, they get along pretty well. They disagree. There's no Cristero situation happening anymore. There's no threats of regional succession, which means that all the states are relatively happy. We know that's not that true, and that the values of the Mexican political system are independence and democracy, right? Which is different from the failed states like Afghanistan, Somalia, and Pakistan, right? Good.
Yeah.
Any questions so far? Are you starting to see between the structure of your papers and this one? I know that it's kind of a stretch, but what's happening is that I'm taking two different arguments that have their own argumentative structures and trying to place them together, eliminate both of them by doing that, right? So it's a different form of argumentation. So both Caputo and Krauss understand present-day Mexico as a place where subjective opinions and responses are violently repressed. Multiple corrupt agencies and individuals sustain collective feelings of suspicion and high levels of violence, seen both in the streets and in the media, facilitate a perpetual state of anxiety and fear in some states. They also agree in understanding that the violence in the north is the gravest problem to face Mexico since the revolution. Finally, while Krauss does, as already noted, recognize the severity of the problem of drug-related violence in Mexico, he does not seek to affect the stability of the Mexican state in any significantly serious way, as Caputo does. That's the end. What I'm lacking here is a conclusion, I think. The thing about these papers is that it's very difficult to, because like with these assignments, he wanted them always to be short. And it's difficult to crunch a structure, because you guys are learning structure in 5 paragraphs is kind of impossible to put on 1 page, right? But as you write more and more, like you learn the values of precision and kind of like, and condensing these different structures into 3 paragraphs maybe, right? Which is what I have. I have a first paragraph addressing one argument, a second addressing the other, and the third bringing them together, right? And I'm not really siding with either, but I'm just putting them in the same place. Yeah, so this is more of just a summary. If I was writing a paper like you guys, I might include a final paragraph where I put myself in, as I keep saying. Where I say like, where I really come on strong in supporting one of these guys, and then I provide my own evidence. I provide evidence that doesn't exist in either of their arguments, and then back one of them, or back neither of them, or back both of them with evidence, right? This is how we use what other people have written when we're writing something on our own. Are you guys using secondary sources in your papers? Like, are you reading things and using those in your essays? Yeah. So, So you don't have to. Are all of you agreeing with the secondary sources?
Yeah.
So you're using secondary sources as evidence.
Yes.
Yeah. You can also use secondary sources as kind of talking heads that you disagree with, right?
Yeah.
And use that to bolster an argument that you want to get across, right? So if I wanted to develop this into something real, I could even write this. Say I wanted to change this into something that I was going to write in 2014 right now. I could say in 2010, two prominent American intellectuals had a published debate about Mexico as a failed state. And then I could do this, but then I could start talking about what's happening in Iguala, right? And bring it to the present and add evidence and make that the goal of the essay, right? So, yeah. And as I was saying to Benjamin, it's been difficult for me to really track down these essays that have this really very clean structure, because that's not the way I write. That's the way I started, I think. But I'm sure this is how you guys feel in Spanish, right? When you start out in Spanish, you learn structure, and then you start to do different things. You start to experiment. But I think that in most essays, if they're good essays, you can detect the ghost of a structure, right? And you can finish them feeling that you've read a structure without really seeing like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I thought that I would show you. Any questions about this?
Any questions about this assignment or this example that Mark was sharing with us today?
These are compare contrast more than argumentative, as you said, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But a compare and contrast can, like I said, can be a form of an argumentative essay. Yeah. Do you agree with that, Benjamin?
I'm sorry?
Would you agree with that? That a compare and contrast can be a form of argumentative?
Sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Parker? I have a lot of questions, but
Do you have?
You guys have some other questions you want to ask about this?
I have some questions here. For example, imagine that, with vegetarians, like we're talking about, what are your things, your arguments, your ideas? What are you talking about?
My arguments?
Yeah, like the ideas,
Like vegetarian?
There you go.
So sorry.
Vegetarians?
Yeah, or like.
Well, so sorry. I just bought next to so
Yeah, like for example, imagine that as you said, like we're talking about Mexico, and then we talk about Iguala, like bringing that evidence of secondary source. But what about like maybe we're talking about, I don't know, imagine that we're talking about two different people. I want to support one of those, but with a really secondary source, like really, like it's not even the topic. But I always think, I'm always writing, and it's like, oh, I can, I don't know, bring something about like a psychological fact, about, I don't know, the brain, something, attack it with that. And is that right? Or?
That's permissible. It's just like, sometimes it's good to like stay, to keep yourself in the realm of primary sources and of the task at hand.
Yeah.
Because like that's a natural result of writing, that you think about all these crazy connections that you can make, and you want to write them. So this is such a cool and unique way to write this paper. Unfortunately, it's hard to pull off all of the time, right? Depending on how obscure the secondary source that you want to bring in is. If the secondary sources are kind of a bit more related, then you say not so far out, and you have a collection of them, then it's a great way to write a paper. It's a great way to write an argumentative paper. Okay. I think it's really important to include secondary sources, always.
Yeah.
I didn't here, right? Just the two primary sources. But also, I didn't have an argument, right? I didn't have an agenda.
Yeah.
I didn't have an objective except to summarize and contrast, compare these two articles. If I did, that's when I would have brought in secondary sources and tried to kind of develop my own argument based on bits and pieces of what these guys are saying and stuff that I've researched outside of the two. Awesome.
Thank you. Yeah.
Anybody else have any questions they want to ask about the essay or the assignment in general?
What about the citation in this paragraph, in this essay?
The citation.
Yes.
So with this assignment, we were just required to have a works cited. And I didn't use any in-text citations because I didn't quote them, right? And so if this were like an 8-page paper and there was a confusion of secondary sources, also a form of a citation is also writing the title, right? The Fall of Mexico. I should have cited there, actually. Should have cited there. There should be a citation saying where that article appeared and referring you to the citation. So that's the Atlantic, December 2009. So what would it be in APA? It's the Atlantic 2009. How do you cite a magazine?
How should you cite?
First, we could do that, and we'd be safe. We could do that and we'd be safe, right?
But it will be the last name and then the first letter of the first name. No?
Yeah, how else could you do it? What could you include in the parentheses?
Can we do that? The Atlantic? I don't know.
No, ¿cómo es? You do that?
Put them, then comma, then P.
We need a P?
We need a P?
P.
We need a P. No, we need the first initial,
I mean.
the initial first name? Just, what is it? Just the last name, right? So we can include, Caputo?
But we have the name
Yeah.
right afterwards, right?
Right, so I think what they're saying is one way you could do it is in the Fall of Mexico and then put Caputo 2009 in parentheses without the first name.
Yes.
Okay.
It's one option, because in the references down below, you would have all those addresses.
Or you could do this.
Or you could just say Caputo and then 2009 addresses.
Okay. You could also do the Fall of Mexico. Article that originally, is that how you spell originally?
Yep.
Yeah, appeared in the,
Yeah, it's a little tricky.
where's the undo? There it is.
There it is.
In the Atlantic, which we need to italicize. Oh.
It's K, it's,
Okay, right, of course.
Yeah.
The Atlantic magazine. Well, an article, hold on, let me see, an article by Phil Caputo, by journalist Caputo. Sorry, this is getting a little bit out of hand. Well, no, that's kind of wrong.
well, that's fine. Yeah, and this is important too, because we use citations, right, to distinguish between what's not an original idea and what's not an original idea, right? So in this case, this assignment is pretty clear that it's just looking at two articles, right? So the rules here are a little bit different, I think, in citing here, because this is a little bit different type of writing. One question I did have, though, Parker, was if the instructor for this assignment gave you any types, or what type of criteria did they give you to follow, if you can remember, to develop this? Did you have, what were some things that he or she was looking for when you developed this writing? Do you recall?
It's 4 years ago, 5 years ago.
Okay.
But yeah, I think he he definitely stressed that he wanted a clear, he wanted it to be clear that we read the articles in question, right? So that required that we summarize them as succinctly as possible because we also have a length limit. So to show that we had read these things and also to paraphrase the argument that we got from each.
So there were no direct quotes. He wanted it all in your.
Yeah, he didn't want quotes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. We didn't have the space for quotes.
Right.
But I remember having trouble with this assignment partly because of the length requirement, specifically.
Being short.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shorter. I think the shorter the more difficult. Actually, like a lot of application essays. We would have like cover letter stuff together, right? Or did we go over the other? Yeah. So with that kind of format, that really official format that you use when you're writing things like application essays or filling out a cover letter for a job, it's similar to this, right? It's like, how do I express all of this in such a small space?
Can we go to the second paragraph? I want to share some language that you're using that I think will also apply to your writing assignment. If you look at is it the second? Text, the idea of the failed state identifying with the combined media. All right, so is this the,
Do we have the third paragraph?
there's 3 paragraphs, right? Okay. So in the second paragraph, when he's contrasting the second point of view here, he's referencing the first point of view, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So,
However, Krause would disagree with Caputo's notion of Mexico as a failed state.
right. See, right there, that phrase attacks the idea of Mexico being a failed state. He's using language there to connect, saying what's wrong with the first paragraph. And this is our objective also, this is your objective when you introduce the counter argument, to say what's wrong with the initial argument, right? So just as Parker's done here, he's using language to specifically now contrast, say, okay, now there's another side, there's another perspective. This is language that you all need to be looking for in the counter argument and also in the rebuttal, right? When you're saying what's wrong with what I just mentioned. Okay, so I think that's important to point out, to look at the language here that he's using to compare, directly link, saying, okay, I presented this side, now I'm presenting this side, right? And this example here is a good example of being more objective than, in our case, we're being more what? If it's not objective, it's more subjective, right? Subjective being what? What's that mean?
Oh, like your point of view.
Making your point of view. See how he's leaving his point of view out. And certainly this is one approach. And if you read like newspapers, sometimes, depending on the publication, you'll see more argumentative essays more objectively presented more like this, right? Saying, here's one side, this person said this, another paragraph they said this, and then the third paragraph was what? What was the objective of his last paragraph?
To convince.
Is it to convince? What was the objective of the first paragraph? To present the view of whom? Caputo, whatever. Okay. The second paragraph was to what?
Point of view of
Okay. And the third paragraph,
It starts with both.
you talk about what? The similarities, right? Right, because the other two is like there are differences, right? We're talking about the differences. He's talking about the differences. Okay.
This is why it's an essay that's more of a summary, right? Because instead of having the last paragraph be the introduction of my thoughts, right? The introduction of subjectivity to the argumentative essay, I just have the similarities. It ends with the similarities, right? So there is some kind of conflict going on in the first and second paragraph, but it's only between the two people that I'm describing. There's nothing of me there. And the only thing I do at the end is there's nothing of me in the end either, except for, you know, organizing. Should we look at the other one? Do we have time?
Sure.
Okay.
No more questions about this example here?
The other one is something I wrote my senior year of college. It uses the Chicago style, as you can see, which is with footnotes. And it's about voting. It's about felon disenfranchisement, which is this practice in the United States of denying people that have been imprisoned the right to vote, right? And how much of a problem that is. I guess we don't have time to read through all of this, but we can maybe get a sense of the structure. Sometimes when you write longer papers, it's nice to add a quote at the beginning from a secondary source, even if it is a secondary source that you don't necessarily include in your paper, right? Because this doesn't show up. The first paragraph is about the American democracy and the right to vote. No mention yet of prisoners, right? So it's an introduction. The second paragraph introduces this idea of voting disenfranchisement, right? Denying the right to vote. The third paragraph introduces the idea of race into felon disenfranchisement. So oftentimes, there's a disproportionate amount of people that aren't allowed to vote that are African American and Hispanic in the United States. And they are often Democrats. So that's a problem, right? Next paragraph is about the United States' unique position as a country that denies former prisoners the right to vote. It happens in a few other countries, but never as severely it does in the US. Gosh, there's a lot here to go over.
I'm curious, Parker, how did you approach this assignment? Do you like using outlines? How do you get started writing something like this? Because this is the end product.
Yeah.
And it's how many pages? It's a pretty good length essay, 12 pages.
12 pages.
Citations. How do you start? How do you get into these ideas?
My strategy is to read a lot of detailed notes, and then to take those notes and change them into an outline, right? So for this, I read maybe like 5 or 6 articles, and I already had the idea, and so I went onto some databases and found relevant articles, and found some stuff in newspapers and read that and took notes, and then formulated some kind of sloppy outline. But usually the way I write is I don't always stick to the outline. I have a rough one in the beginning, and I fill in different pieces without necessarily worrying about things like transitioning or the way that things fit together, but mostly about just feeling this overall sense of fluidness and continuity. I know it's not the best, it's not really teachable. I made a lot of mistakes. I was really bad at writing for a long time. I just practiced enough to make my way work. I was kind of stubborn about ever doing things as formal as I could. Yeah, this one had an outline.
So when you say you stumbled, and how did your process change over time that made you feel like you were getting into and becoming a better writer? What were some things that you did differently over that trajectory?
I thought, well, things like, that's a difficult question. Honestly, like reading more and taking more detailed notes is what helped me write better papers.
When you took those notes, did you have like, did you jot down the citation?
Yeah, I would always do page number. So I would take a note in the margin of the article that I would read with an original thought, right? With something with a comment of mine on what was said, or I would just say interesting. And then in a notebook, I would write down part of that quote with a page number to return to. And then sometimes I would even color code different citations, different notes that apply to different topics. So for example, here we have, first of all, the history of the American Constitution and voting, the importance of voting in a democracy, right? That's one topic. And then there's race. And then there's felon disenfranchisement. And then there are the prisons, right? So there are these different things that together make up my argument, but can be thematically sorted together. And it is a good idea to sort your citations and to write down more than you think you would use. Because sometimes you'll have taken a note about something and thought it to be like tossable, then it just becomes perfect depending on how your paper starts to change.
How did you guys do that? How did you organize your thoughts as you're reading? Because all of you were reading a lot, reading articles and books. Did you guys do anything similar or different?
Usually this Mr. Since I started. Like for example, I think that helped me a lot is in this essay was like to print them and then to highlight the ideas that I think that are curious or like interesting or like would be good. But I don't start with an idea. I didn't start with it. Well, I started with an idea, but then I reject the idea. Then I just start reading, and then putting, I don't know, link them, think about like how it would be.
So you highlighted the text, you printed them out and highlighted?
Yeah, I highlighted the important parts, and then like, I think, I see all of them, and then like, then it's like, oh, okay, so I can make this. And I think another I don't know, option. So I can do this with different things, and I don't know, I just see the best. And
one thing I forgot to say about organizing this essay is that I do remember it was for a class called Mathematics and Politics, right? So part of this paper is math, and you have to prove something with the math in the paper. So I started out with wanting to prove a hypothesis that I know had been worked on before, and expanding on that. The hypothesis is that I looked at the 2000 election when George W. Bush came into office, and was attempting to prove that had all of those felons who had been disenfranchised voted in the 2000 election based on their racial political makeup, then George Bush would have lost. Because Florida is one of the states that disenfranchises the most.
And that was the deciding.
And that was the deciding state. So the goal was to prove that had we not had such intense laws around felony disenfranchisement, that Al Gore would have won the election. So that's what I built the paper around. I filled in the history and the direction.
Anybody else want to share their organizational experience, anything similar to Abraham or something different?
Yeah.
That you followed? Rosario, what system did you follow?
Well, when I read, I take notes of the creation, the information of the article, and I write the idea, like the quote, and then I don't know, like my thoughts start to come up, and I start writing, and I don't care about the grammar or anything, and I just write. And at the end, I just like kind of see what can work and what I don't need. But usually I don't delete anything, because sometimes there's something that I say I don't need this, but then later on I realize that I can use it as well. So yes, you have it.
Good. Good idea. Okay, anyone else?
Well, I always make the outline as you um, told us to make the essay. But when I was in Prope, I always wrote the main ideas and the topic sentence, and then I start to read a lot of the articles, and then I have the idea. I wrote the main idea of the articles, and if there is a citation, I got the citation. Many of
Put it
them
in your outline.
in my outline, many of them, and I start writing. And it depends of my point of view of the citation I'm going to add.
Good.
My organization is a little bit different. I first write my ideas, what I want to share, and then I start to read, and if my idea accords with the idea of the author or the articles, I say, okay, this idea is going to help me with my idea, and I'm going to support my idea with this phrase. That's my organization.
Did anyone do this, or maybe this happened to you in your case, where you thought first about your ideas and then you tried to find those sources and then you had problems finding those sources? Did that happen to anybody?
Yes.
Okay, so although that could work, Elizabeth's method could work, right? If you can find those sources. But sometimes we start thinking, oh, I want to say this, and then we start looking, and then it becomes more difficult, right? So one way is to start reading first, maybe, and then get some ideas. We all kind of have a general idea, right, of what we want to write about. But yeah.
Yes, it's hard. I read like 10 articles to find what I want.
Yeah.
The trick is like finding, because oftentimes you don't want to find someone who says exactly what you want to say, right? Because then it's like, well, there's no point in me writing this essay, right? Because there's already someone who has this argument laid out perfectly. Trick is finding people that say different things and using them in kind of like a collage, or combining them to say what you want to say, right? So you can find articles that might not necessarily be 100% about your topic or your argument or your thesis statement, but you can find things that generally, like, you know, that share, like, that have topical similarities, right? We can pull out quotes or pull out specific points that, taken out of context of that article or the argument that you take them from, fit with what you want to say.
Okay, any other questions? Getting pretty close here to an hour. I think you have a class or something.
Yeah.
Any other final questions that you'd like to ask Parker about either the assignment or his preparation or anything else? Going once.
I have a question here. What's up? I'm struggling with this. For example, I have an idea, right? I'm talking about destination here, and I have two sites from the same writers that supports the same idea, like it's like to have rules and like a formal procedure to like do or proceed with destination. But as an analysis, since both of the things that I'm putting here in the paragraph, like to describe them, since they're to the same goal. I mean, do you know what I'm trying to say? Like they go the same way. They're like opposite and opposite. I really don't know how. Or just a question, like general question, like how do you analyze your evidence? Like, do you have like I don't know. I don't know how to.
The system?
Yeah, like a system or like any idea or something.
How do I analyze what? Arguments?
Yeah, exactly. Because like evidence. How do you evidence? Yeah, argue with the evidence sometimes. Because I have troubles, like a lot of troubles, like trying to like say something because when you analyze this, I don't know, from you, right? And I really have a hard time doing analysis of my evidence in the whole thing.
Sometimes you have to abuse the evidence a little bit.
Abuse.
Yeah, meaning like you have to bend the evidence to serve you. Does that make sense? Sometimes it can be like, it's like, oh yeah, this is perfect. Like, and then you start writing about it, like, well, maybe this doesn't actually help me that much. you have to find kind of clever ways to make the evidence work for you, and that's difficult, right? But I think I don't think it's a teachable thing. I mean, there are reading skills that you can teach, and there are writing skills that you can teach, and that you need both for evidence. Should be a course on reading skills, critical reading. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Margaret, for sharing this work. And, hopefully we can schedule another class here. Next unit, we're going to be starting poetry, so now we're going to be all poets for the next 4 weeks. So, yeah, I keep telling them that, but I don't know if
They're not excited.
So this is going to be really fun. Yeah.
I'm gonna try and come as much as I can.
That'd be great. All right. Well,
Thanks,
thank you very
guys.
much.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Sorry about the cell phone.
So you replaced your old.
Well, it's not like just got a cell phone. I haven't got a phone call. All right.
Very good. All right, see you later. Okay, includes this, maybe, thank you. I'd like to, if I could, maybe revisit Abraham's question, because I think it's worth discussing a little bit more.
Yeah, I would.
Go ahead.